Learn English through story. The Last Request. James Thornton was a man of principles, known in the small town of Riverton as someone who never bent the rules, no matter the circumstances. He was a lawyer by profession, a man who believed deeply in justice and the law, which had always served as the foundation of his life. Over the years, his reputation grew, and he became the go-to person for anyone seeking a fair trial or sound legal advice. But while James was respected, he was not particularly liked. His unwavering adherence to the law made him seem cold and unapproachable to many. James had a wife, Margaret, who was as warm and kind as he was rigid and unyielding. They had no children, not by choice but by fate, and Margaret had filled that void with community work and caring for those less fortunate. The two were well matched in their differences, but even Margaret sometimes felt the chill of her husband's ironclad morality. She often wondered if he ever questioned whether the strict application of the law always resulted in true justice. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, James returned home to find a letter waiting for him on the kitchen table. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. James's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the script of his estranged father, Thomas Thornton, whom he hadn't spoken to in over 20 years. James opened the letter with trembling hands. The last time he had heard from his father was when he had been disowned for defending a man whom Thomas believed to be guilty. The letter contained only a few lines. "James, I am old, and my days are numbered. I have a request to come to see me, one last time. There is something I need to tell you." A father. Margaret, who had been watching him from across the room, saw the emotions flicker across his usually stoic face. "James, is everything all right?" she asked softly. "It's from my father," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret approached him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You should go, James. Whatever happened between you two, he's reaching out now. You might regret it if you don't." James nodded slowly. The memories of his father's harsh words, of their final argument, were still vivid in his mind. But the tone of the letter was different, almost pleading. He decided to go. The next morning, James set out for the small town where his father lived. The journey was long, giving him ample time to reflect on their strained relationship. Thomas had been a man of strong opinions, with a firm belief in right and wrong, much like James. But their differences had torn them apart. Thomas had never forgiven James for defending a man who, in his eyes, was guilty of a heinous crime, even though James had proven the man's innocence. When James arrived at his father's house, he was struck by how much it had deteriorated. The once proud home was now run down, the garden overgrown and the paint peeling from the walls. He hesitated at the door, but then he knocked. A nurse opened the door and led James to his father's room. The sight of the once robust and intimidating Thomas Thornton lying frail and bedridden was a shock to James. The old man's eyes flickered open, and when he saw his son, they filled with something James had never seen before: real regret. "James," Thomas rasped, his voice weak. "You came." "Of course I came," James replied, unsure of what else to say. "I don't have much time left," Thomas said, struggling with each word. "There's something I need to confess, a broken bar, something I've carried with me for far too long." James sat down beside the bed, his heart pounding. "What is it, father?" Thomas took a deep, labored breath. "Years ago, a broken bar. Before you were born, a broken bar. I did something unforgivable. There was a man, a good man, who trusted me. He came to me for help, and instead, I betrayed him." James listened in silence as his father continued. He was in trouble, caught up in something he didn't fully understand. "He asked me to hide something for him, something dangerous." I agreed, thinking I was helping a friend. "But when the authorities came, I panicked. I handed it over to them, and he was arrested. He was sentenced to life in prison because of what I did." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What happened to him?" Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "He died in prison, James, and I've lived with that guilt every day since. I thought I was doing the right thing, but all I did was ruin a man's life." James sat in stunned silence, trying to process what his father had just confessed. The man who had raised him to believe in justice and righteousness had committed an act of betrayal so profound that it had haunted him for decades. "Why are you telling me this now?" James asked, his voice shaking. "Because," Thomas whispered, "I don't want to die with this secret. I want to make amends, if I can. But I'm too old and too weak to do anything. That's why I need you, James. I need you to find his family, to tell them the truth. I need you to help them, to give them whatever they need to make up for what I did." James felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. His father's request was simple in words but monumental in its implications. Could he, a man who had dedicated his life to the law, do something that went against everything he believed in to grant his father's dying wish? "A broken bar, I don't know if I can do that," James stammered. "What you're asking, a broken bar? It goes against the law." Thomas's eyes filled with desperation. "The law failed that man, James." "I failed him. But you, a broken bar, you have the power to make things right. Please, for once, listen to your heart, not just your head." James stood up, his mind racing. He needed time to think. "I need to go," he said abruptly, turning away from his father's pleading eyes. "I need to think about this." Without another word, James left the room and the house, his thoughts in turmoil. He drove back to Riverton in silence, Margaret's gentle concern doing little to ease his troubled mind when he returned home. For days, James was haunted by his father's words. He found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about the law and justice. The man his father had betrayed had been a victim, and the law had done nothing to protect him. Could it be that there were times when the law was not enough? Margaret noticed the change in her husband and gently urged him to follow his heart. "James, sometimes the right thing isn't always the legal thing. Sometimes it's about compassion, about doing what you know is right in your soul." Finally, after days of internal struggle, James made a decision. He would find the man's family and tell them the truth. It wasn't a legal obligation, but it was a moral one. And perhaps, by doing this, he could not only grant his father's last request but also find some peace within himself. James's search took weeks, but he eventually found the familiar daughter who had grown up without her father, her life marked by his absence. When James met her, he told her everything: his father's betrayal, the guilt he had carried, and his own struggle to do what was right. The woman listened in silence, her face unreadable. When James finished, she sighed deeply. "I've spent my whole life hating the man who betrayed my father," she said softly. "I never knew it was your father, Mr. Thornton. But I appreciate your honesty." James offered her financial support, a small gesture to atone for the wrongs of the past. But more than that, he offered her his help, his commitment to do whatever he could to make her life easier. In the months that followed, James found a new purpose in helping the woman and her family. He realized that justice wasn't always about strict adherence to the law but about compassion, understanding, and the willingness to right wrongs, even when it was difficult. Thomas Thornton passed away peacefully a few months later, knowing that his son had granted his last request. James stood at his father's grave, feeling a sense of closure he had never expected. He had always believed that the law was the highest form of justice, but now he understood that true justice was about more than rules and regulations. It was about humanity. As James walked away from the grave, hand in hand with Margaret, he knew he would never be the same. He had learned that sometimes, the hardest decisions were the ones that made us question our deepest beliefs. But in the end, doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy, was the true measure of a man's character. And that, James realized, was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoyed, then please like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.